One day, while walking home from kindergarten, I told my mom that I was having trouble making friends at school. She didn't take this comment lightly, partly because there had been a string of other red flags that my teachers had mentioned to my parents. In addition to hiring a private psychologist, my parents requested that a neuropsych evaluation be initiated through the school. This is when I met Dr. Scott Yarbrough, the school psychologist. In his office, he would explain that he'd be running a psychological test on me, mainly through asking me a series of questions. One exchange stood out in particular. Dr. Yarbrough asked me if I heard voices in my head. I said yes. Dr. Yarbrough, clearly concerned now, followed up with, "Well, what are they saying to you?" To which I replied, "They're saying, what are they saying to you?" I then went on to explain how my ears were part of my head. So hearing voices in my ears meant that I was hearing voices in my head. This was one of just several answers over several weeks of testing that led both the private psychologist and Dr. Yarbrough to both diagnose me with autism spectrum disorder. But what is autism spectrum disorder? It's defined as a serious developmental disorder that impairs the ability to interact and communicate. A couple years later, I was also diagnosed with prosopagnosia, or face blindness as it's commonly referred to. This is characterized by the inability to recognize even familiar people, like family members, by their face. So, the problem that I faced as a child was that these are two serious disorders that both impaired my ability to socialize. Yet I'm a very social person. Ever since I was little, I would try to make friends anywhere I went. I would run up and try and have conversations any chance I got. However, despite my best efforts, with my disabilities, I had trouble connecting to people, especially my peers. For all of my childhood, and until high school, I was a social outcast. But this talk today isn't about how autism or prosopagnosia hindered my social ability. It's about how I learned to use them to socially succeed. Being born with these two disabilities felt like I'd been specially designed to never understand human interaction. And for many years, that was just the case. Every one of us experiences the world in their own unique way. My autism and prosopagnosia dominates my worldview, meaning I'm socially out of sync. I don't understand social cues or social patterns. Some of you may know what I mean. That awkward conversation you just had with a coworker or maybe a peer, forgetting someone's name, someone who you for sure have met before, things like that. The problem was, not only did I not think about those moments, I didn't even recognize them. Even basic social things like what's appropriate to say or do, that learning people's names is important, think about how others are feeling. Those were all foreign concepts to me. On top of that, my prosopagnosia meant that I had no way to recognize who was who. I was the energetic kid who would yell and point you when I wanted someone's attention. I was the socially awkward kid who would poke my peers while we waited in line. I was the problem student who would not stop talking about Legos or Star Wars or Lego Star Wars, even during lesson time. I was the student who would not stop talking even after I'd been told to stop. I was a kid who had no one to eat lunch with, no one to go to my birthday parties, and no one to sit next to on the bus for field trips. I was a kid who was finally invited to the movies, but only after I stood outside the theater alone did I realize that was only a joke. And little changed for me as I transitioned from kindergarten to elementary school to middle school. However, I reached a turning point on my 7th grade field trip to Yosemite. For the trip, an aide was assigned to me, someone to help me through this prolonged social exposure. His name was Norm. One night, following stargazing with my group, Norm and I walked at the back of the line and we just started talking. Eventually, we started talking about me. And I told him how I had trouble making friends, despite my best efforts. And I found the whole thing to be confusing. So Norm looked at me and he said, well, you should figure that out, because that stuff is important in life. He didn't mean this in a negative or a what's wrong with you sort of way. He meant this as a sincere piece of advice. You should figure that out. And I started to realize that he was right. I'm a social person whose entire state of being is filtered through a mind that's socially blind. Something had to change. I had to figure it out. So that's exactly what I did, using the unique way that I view the world. The best way I can describe this is that I view the world and absorb the world as patterns. So during that prolonged time with my classmates, I started to view their social interactions as patterns. And I started to recognize some things that I hadn't before. I realized that knowing someone's name and recognizing them was an important first step in building a connection. I learned that talking about what others are interested, not just what I'm interested in, helps them communicate. I learned that mirroring how others are acting helps everyone feel comfortable. I learned that people deliberately chose who they spent their time with, not just running up to whoever's around. With these, I started to build a general understanding of socializing. And this new intellectual understanding of socialization allowed me to notice how others operated. But just recognizing it wasn't enough. I had to actually implement them. To turn newly discovered and unnatural ideas into my own personal laws of socialization. Over time, I realized that being autistic wasn't all bad. I had my strengths. Strengths that could help in my areas of social weaknesses. For starters, I'm very energetic and outgoing, a byproduct of my social drive. I'm passionate about things I love. As a kid, I had my Legos phase, my Star Wars phase, and inevitably my Lego Star Wars phase. Now in my 20s, it's more sneakers and baseball. SpongeBob has always been a big passion of mine, evident by that photo and that sick chain I was rocking. Which brings me to memory. I have a great memory. I used to quote verbatim entire episodes of SpongeBob after watching it just once. Pretty impressive. I'm detail-oriented and literal. I loved Annie's mac and cheese as a kid. Still do. However, when I was finally able to make a box, my parents came home to a now soggy cardboard box submerged in cloudy, boiling water, because the first step on the box wasn't to take the pasta out of the box. Over time, these strengths allowed me to actually implement the social skills I now understood. My outgoingness and lack of a social filter allowed me to start and hold conversations while being confident and comfortable. My memory, my passion helped too. Instead of just focusing on my own passions, I dug deep and developed passions for common conversation points, things like sports, pop culture, current events, local points of interest. My interests have expanded, partly because I'm able to talk to others about what interests them, not just talking about what interests me. But starting a conversation is one thing. Having others feel comfortable around you is another. This is where being detail-oriented has helped. It allows me to notice how others are acting and feeling. It allows me to mirror their energy. I look at how someone is physically positioned, how they're talking, what level of volume they're talking at, and it allows us both to feel more comfortable. Being detail-oriented has also helped me with my prosopagnosia. Instead of focusing on faces, I focus on other aspects of someone to help me recognize them, like a distinct haircut or a watch they wear, maybe their voice or their height. For example, this is Tracy. I worked with Tracy for years, and she wore the same gold watch every single day until one day she didn't. When my mom came to drop us off at school, Tracy came up and I walked right by her because I had no idea who she was. Now I focus on multiple points to cut back on situations like those. But once I'm able to recognize someone, I'm able to learn their name. Once I can learn their name, I'm able to start building that connection. As my social skills developed, I started to make friends. However, I quickly realized that I needed to manage my social time wisely. I like to consider myself a social introvert. So I love socializing, but I find it draining. I see some of you are like, me too. I realized I had to use my time wisely. This is where literal thinking plays a part. Whenever I have invites from my friends or family, I run a sort of cost-benefit analysis in my head. I think about if memories will be made, if pictures will be taken, how recently I've seen everyone, if I'll be meeting new people, if I have plans with them later on, and others. I make decisions based on all the information, which allows me to use my time where it's most effective and with a wide variety of people. Today, I've touched on just a handful of ways that autism has gone from my personal weakness to my personal strength. But I don't want you walking away from this thinking I'm some robot who taught itself to socialize. This is all me. I'm still the same passionate and energetic and confused autistic kid I was when I was eating lunch alone in middle school. The only difference is I now use my strength in my areas of weaknesses. I stopped and I learned about this strange world I was born into. So I didn't have to push to try and fit in anywhere. Instead, I could just be myself and find how and where I fit. I'm glad I have autism and prosopagnosia. Sure, if I was neurotypical, I could have had an easier or less painful path to today. But I sure wouldn't be as self-aware or as confident with who I am as I am today. And I like who I am. And I know that my family and my friends do too. I get to experience the world in my own unique way. We all do. And I know just as much as anyone that sometimes the world can be confusing or frustrating or lonely. But we all have our own strengths. Recognizing them and utilizing them is how we grow as individuals. Because we sure can't change who we are deep inside. The most we can do is be aware. Be aware of how we view the world, of what our strengths are, and of what weaknesses, we still have to overcome. I hope you all figure it out, because that stuff can be important in life. Thank you.